I'm certainly glad that you're here this evening, and I hope you've got your Bibles out. And go ahead and place some marker there in Daniel chapter 2, as that's where we're going to be spending a good deal of our time here this evening. Last week, we noted this section of Daniel that was just read for us, where Daniel was told by God that he was one that was dearly beloved, or greatly beloved, the New King James Version says. Other translations say he's highly esteemed, or you're precious. And I like the translation of the CSB that says you are a man that is greatly treasured by God. It suggests recognizing the value of one. And to think about Daniel's character and what it took for him to be this one that 3 times in the book of Daniel is told by God, you are highly esteemed and greatly valued and greatly treasured. Last week, as we began our series of lessons, we looked in Daniel chapter 1, and we saw a young man at the age of about 14 or 15, in all likelihood, taken away from his home, put in an ungodly environment, and yet in that ungodly environment, he remained faithful because he knew God's word, he made godly companions, and he determined ahead of time what his standard was going to be. Now we come into Daniel chapter 2, and what is a very familiar chapter to us, no doubt, where Daniel is faced with the interpreting of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And while there's a lot to be learned from that dream and what it points to, our focus really tonight is on the story of Daniel and his faithfulness in that environment. Let's begin by understanding the situation of Daniel chapter 2, and then we'll just see how the chapter unfolds. The situation is such now that we are in the 2nd year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. There has been some controversy as to exactly how is he in his 2nd year, but they have completed 3 years of training already at the end of chapter 1. And it is likely that what happens is the ascension year of Nebuchadnezzar is the 1st year of training. The way the Babylonians calculated the reign, the 1st year then would have been the year after the ascension, and then finally the 2nd year of his reign would have been the 3rd year of Daniel and his friends' training that they've just completed in the wisdom and in the literature of the Chaldeans. And so here we are. Daniel's probably by this time been in captivity about 3 years or so. And Nebuchadnezzar has a troubling dream. And this dream that he has is so troubling, the Bible tells us, that Nebuchadnezzar can't sleep. In fact, the word dreams in the plural, as it occurs here in verse 1, probably indicates that he had this dream more than once. In other words, he has the dream, then he has it again the next night, and he has it again the next night, and he's wondering, what does this dream mean? What is the significance of that dream? And it's having the effect that it so troubles him and he's so anxious that he cannot sleep and he wants to understand it. So Nebuchadnezzar sends for the Chaldeans and for the magicians and the astrologers and the sorcerers to come and to tell him what this dream means. It is obvious from how the story unfolds that Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego are not among that number of the group that was called. It may be because they were just simply wise men and not one of these other categories. Or it may be that because they have just completed their training, that they're still interns and would not have been among those that were called. But these men are called, and Nebuchadnezzar tells them when they call, I don't want you to just tell me what the dream means. I want you to tell me the dream. Because Nebuchadnezzar's smart enough to realize if I tell you what I saw, you're going to make something up. So in order for me to know that you are telling the truth, you tell me the dream I had, and then after you tell me the dream I had, you tell me what it means. Of course, all of these men come and tell him that he's asking for the impossible. Listen, in verses 9 to verse 11 of this chapter, you're asking for something that really no man can do. Look at verse 10. There's not a man on earth who can tell the king this matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such a thing of the magicians or the astrologers or the Chaldeans. There's not a person alive that can do what you're asking us to do. But Nebuchadnezzar says, listen, I've made up my mind. My decision is firm, he had said earlier, and therefore, if you don't give the interpretation of this dream, everybody among these men are going to be put to death. That's your choice. If you can't do it, then it's really worthless to keep you around. You're not providing any value. And so every one of you is going to be executed. Listen to what he said in verse 5 when he said, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you'll be cut in pieces and your house will be made an ash heap. And then in 12 and 13, he became so angry that he gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. I think he was so angry that this edict reached beyond just those that were immediately there to all of the category of the wise men. Every one of you is going to die because you can't interpret this dream. And so Daniel and his companions, verse 13 tells us, would have been among those that would have been executed. Their lives were on the line. So what happens in that background and their lives being on the line is that now Daniel is going to step forward and offer to interpret this dream. In fact, as the story goes here in Daniel chapter 2, Daniel finds out that the wise men are going to be executed, or are going to be killed. Verse 14 says that with counsel and wisdom that Daniel answered Arioch. So he finds out now, Truth Commentary said it's apparent from the fact that Daniel and his fellows were not among those who were brought before the king at first, that they were still considered to be merely apprentices at the Babylonian Academy when the entire episode unfolded at the place. And so they're going to be executed. And as Daniel finds that out, he approaches Arioch, who is identified here as the captain of the king's guard, and he approaches him with counsel and wisdom. There's something to be said about that. We'll make some application in a moment. Daniel finds out that his life's about to be taken away from him. He's going to be executed. He didn't even have a dog in that fight, we'd say, and yet his life's about to be taken away from him. Daniel doesn't fly off the handle. He doesn't respond by saying, what in the world is that stupid king thinking, a man acting like that? Instead, the Bible says he acts with counsel and wisdom, or discretion and discernment, or tact and discretion is how that is translated in other versions. Sinclair Ferguson in his commentary said verse 14 describes Daniel's approach here as one of counsel and wisdom. There was discretion in Daniel's behavior, not only in what he said, but in the way he said what he said. The word translated wisdom is variously rendered in the Old Testament, and it is related to the Hebrew verb meaning to taste. And here it conveys those spiritual instincts of judgment and discernment that we might call a sense of the realities of the situation. Daniel's wisdom was a well-developed sense of spiritual taste. We speak about people having a highly developed taste in many spheres. What we mean is that they're able to tell the difference between foods and drinks or even clothes that seem to the rest of us virtually indistinguishable. Taste is a mysterious sense, and one which experience can develop to a high degree. There are people who can tell the year of a certain wine or the origin of the leaves of a cup of tea. In some ways, spiritual wisdom is just like that. It is the highly developed sense of God's way, learned through obedience to God's word. It is sensitive awareness of the kind of behavior that is appropriate to the child of God in different circumstance. It does not necessarily come with age, but with understanding of the Lord's word and the Lord's way. In other words, the whole point of that is Daniel had good sense and taste into how he answered. Another commentary in commenting upon that said, the prophet in these unusual and extremely difficult circumstances, he just found out he's about to be executed, must have displayed extraordinary tactfulness in the way in which he approached this hardened killer. He wished to know why the king's decree was so hard. It is Daniel's kindness and prudence in asking the question that leads a hard man like Arioch to answer him. No doubt a man like this was accustomed to getting his nasty business done with swiftness and without many words or any emotion whatsoever. In this instance, he made an exception, however, for the kindness and prudence shown by one of the intended victims elicits an answer from one who is essentially a professional exterminator of human beings. In other words, here's this man that is going to be the executor. He's hardened, and yet because of how Daniel approaches him, Daniel is able to make a difference. We want to make some application of that in just a little bit. And so Arioch explains the decision to Daniel, And Daniel says, if you'll just give the king some time, or tell the king to give me some time, I can tell him what the dream means, or God can tell him what the dream means. Because Daniel realizes he can't do that on his own. And it's implied, though not expressly stated, that Nebuchadnezzar said, okay, I'll give you some time, and then you come back and you tell me what the dream means. So what Daniel does is immediately he goes home, and he tells his companions, I take that to be Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, what is going on. And he says to them, I need you to go pray to God and ask God to help me interpret this dream. You seek the mercies of God so that we can be spared. And again, it's implied, though not expressly stated, that that's exactly what they do. They pray that night, and Daniel prays that night, and in the night, God reveals the meaning of this dream to Daniel. And when Daniel receives the meaning of this dream, Daniel doesn't immediately run to Nebuchadnezzar. You know what Daniel immediately does? Daniel immediately gives thanks to God in 20 and 23 for interpreting this dream. I thank you and I praise you. You've given me wisdom and might, and you have made me known to us the king's demand. And so he gives thanks to God, realizing three things. Wisdom and might belong to God. God is in control, and thank you for giving me the blessings that you did. So Daniel then goes and tells the meaning to Nebuchadnezzar. The dream pertains to the latter days. That is, this dream pertained to the church age, the days that began in Acts chapter 2. It pertained to 4 world empires. In fact, Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, you are the head of gold. That first kingdom was the Babylonian kingdom. After you, there was going to rise another kingdom inferior to yours. That's the Medo-Persian kingdom. Then after that, there was going to be another kingdom that was going to arise, a third kingdom that is described as being of bronze that's going to rule over all the earth. That is the Macedonian kingdom, or the Greeks. And then finally, a fourth kingdom is going to rise. They'll be strong as iron, but it's also going to have some weaknesses in it that is seen by the feet and the toes, partly of clay and partly of iron. And that fourth kingdom was the days of the Roman Empire. And of course, the whole point of this dream, particularly summed up in verse 44, is in the days of the Roman Empire, God was going to establish his kingdom, a kingdom that will never be destroyed. That's the church. And so Daniel 2 is a powerful passage. In fact, let me just say this, it's so powerful and so clear that today people that do not believe that God's kingdom has come will argue that the Roman kingdom is going to have to be reestablished in some way, or that there's still a vestige of that kingdom around. Of course, it wouldn't matter because there's been more than 4 kingdoms since then. Either it's already been established or God failed, and it was established in Acts chapter 2. So that's the meaning of the dream. And then Nebuchadnezzar promotes Daniel and his friends and gives them a place of honor. So that's the story of Daniel 2. But my question this evening is really not so much what does that dream mean, though that's important, but what about Daniel's faith? How is it that this man now is able to keep his head in these difficult circumstances? And in a situation where his life is on the line, he's able to maintain his faithfulness in God, to maintain his focus, and to behave and to act in the right way. You know, if you're Daniel, I wonder if Daniel ever thought, much like Job, that it just seems to be one thing right after another. I mean, Daniel 1, it's the king's delicacies. Now my life's on the line. And then later on in Daniel 3, he's not mentioned in that chapter, but his friends have to deal with the fiery furnace. Then the king asks for another dream. And now I've been promoted in the Babylonian kingdom, and now it has collapsed. And now here comes a new kingdom, and I climb to power in it. Now the satraps and the presidents want to throw me in the lion's den. It just seems to be one trial right after another. How is it that Daniel keeps his head and maintains his faithfulness in this circumstance? Well, I think there are a number of things I can learn here from Daniel chapter 2. Number one, Daniel was able to keep his head and behave in the right way because Daniel believed that God was in control and not man. Daniel realized, I think at the end of the day, you know who was in control of things? It wasn't Nebuchadnezzar. In fact, if this was a Bible class and I was to ask you this question, what is the theme of the book of Daniel? The answer you're supposed to give is the most high rules in the kingdoms of men. That is the message of the book of Daniel from beginning until end. How did God know about the kingdoms of Daniel 2? Because God's in control. When God humbled Nebuchadnezzar, you know why he humbled Nebuchadnezzar? That he would know that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men. Do you know in Daniel chapter 5, when Belshazzar sees that writing on the wall, Daniel reminds him, you remember what happened to your dad, or the granddad actually, about how he was humble till he learned that the Most High rules in the kingdoms of men and sets over whom he wants to. And even the visions of Daniel 7 through 12, which we may or may not touch on in this short series of lessons, the visions of Daniel 7 and 12 in such detail about what was going to happen in the future show that ultimately God is the one that's in control of this world. And so you see that in Daniel 4 three times, again in Daniel chapter 5. In fact, in his prayer to God in Daniel chapter 2, one of the things he acknowledged to God in verse 21 is, you change the times and the seasons. You remove kings and raise up kings. You give wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who are understanding. God, I realize it's not Nebuchadnezzar that's in control. It's you that's in control. In fact, Jeremiah went in a very similar statement. Jeremiah chapter 18 and 5 to 10 say, the moment God speaks about a kingdom to take it down, guess what happens? It goes down. The minute that God speaks about exalting the kingdom, guess what happens? That kingdom is exalted. God, not man, is the one that is in control. And this dream, as we said, was evidence of that. That's seen again, as we've already mentioned, in the visions of Daniel chapter 7 through 12. Well, if God is in control, what does that mean? I mean, you put yourself in Daniel's position. If God's in control, what does that mean? Well, if God's the one that's in control of things, what that means is I've got to put my faith in him regardless of the circumstances, because God knows what he's doing. The book of Habakkuk said, God, are you going to do something about how wicked we are? And God said, yeah, I'm going to do something about it. I'm going to raise up the Chaldeans, and they're going to destroy you. And Habakkuk said, God, you can't do that. They're worse than we are. And in Habakkuk chapter 2, really what is the message of the book of Habakkuk is when God tells him the just shall live by faith. You know what that means? Habakkuk, trust me, I'm in control. I know what I'm doing. You may not understand, but I'm in the very last verse. I've got up here of chapter 2 and verse 20. The Lord is in his holy temple. Let all the earth keep silent before him. Really, in reality, if I was to put it probably in a crude way, really what God tells Habakkuk is, I'm in control, shut up and let me rule. Let me take care of things. Don't complain about everything I'm doing. I'm the one that is in control. Do you think I need to learn that lesson today? You know who's in control today? I tell you, it's not Donald Trump. It's not Vladimir Putin. It's not any other world ruler. The one that's in control now is exactly the same one that was in control last year, and the one that was in control the year before that, and the one that will be in control 100 years from now if the world stands, and that is God is the one that rules in the kingdoms of men. And if that's true, I've got to trust him. And that's why Habakkuk says basically at the very end of a book of Habakkuk is, you know what? I'm going to learn to trust in the Lord even if you read that section, even if the blooms are off the trees and even if the blooms are off the trees and the fruit's not on the vines and the labor of the olive trees and the field yields no food and the flock is cut off and there's no herds in the stall. I mean, that's about as dark as you can get. Habakkuk said, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. The Lord God is my strength. In other words, I know even when I don't understand what, God is in control. And I think Daniel understood that. Daniel, that meant if God's in control, it means I don't have to fear because God's my refuge. Psalm 46. The psalmist, God is our refuge, a very present help in the time of trouble. Therefore, we will not fear. Even though the earth be removed and the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though its waters roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with its swellings, no matter what's going on around us, what? I trust because God's my refuge. I rely upon the one that is in control. I may not always understand why he does what he does. Job didn't. But I know God's in control. And that means I can trust his promises. Don't fear, the Lord said. I will not leave you. I'm your helper, Hebrews chapter 13. Romans chapter 8, if God is for us, who can be against us? See, Daniel didn't know exactly how it was going to turn out. It could have turned out with God deciding to allow Daniel and his friends' life to be taken from them, but he knew no matter what happened, God was the one that was in control. And because of that, he remained faithful to God. Tell you something else I think that allowed Daniel to make a difference in his life and in the lives of others is he believed in approaching others with tact and with discretion. You know, it's not only important that in times of difficulty that we stand for truth, it's important how we represent the Lord. It's important that we stand for what is right and we do it in the right way. Daniel used wisdom and discretion. His life was on the line. I mean, again, put yourself in Daniel. I picture in my mind Daniel and his friends are going along, and Arioch, he turns to Arioch and said, "Where are we going?" And Arioch said, "We're going for you to be executed." How would you respond in that circumstance? Would wisdom and discretion go out the door? And yet Daniel in this still understood that a word fitly spoken is invaluable. A word fitly spoken is saying the right thing at the right time, but saying it in the right way. He understood that a soft answer can turn away wrath. You know what likely would have happened to Daniel if Daniel had turned to Arioch and said, "How stupid can y'all be? I mean, I haven't done anything. Nobody can do this. I mean, how could anybody act that way?" You know what likely would have happened to Daniel? He likely would have been executed. I don't know about you, but there have been times when I've dealt with people that I probably haven't always used the tact and discretion that I needed to, and you know what it usually accomplishes? Not a whole lot. Whether it's because we think we've been wronged in some business deal or somebody hasn't treated us the right way. Usually at the end of the day, when we don't use tact and discretion and self-control, it usually doesn't accomplish our purpose much at all. You know what often go a long way in accomplishing our purpose would be to act with some amount of self-control and discretion. Don't compromise. That's not what we're saying. What we are saying is when we walk in wisdom toward those without, we have to allow our speech to be seasoned with what? With grace. It's like we season our food. We need to say things in the right way. We need to show perfect courtesy toward all men, Titus 3:2. Kindness and understanding and speak every consideration. Always show gentleness to who? To all people. You mean our enemies? You mean people that mistreat you and people that don't stand where we stand and for what we stand for? I think the answer is yes. And what we might find is if we use tact and discretion, we may make a difference like what Daniel did, as opposed to acting in a way that just doesn't fit with the gospel of Jesus Christ. The servant of God needs to be gentle. He needs to be kind. He needs to be patient. You can stand for what's right, and you can stand for what is right in the right way. You can express convictions, and you can express it in a way that it is seasoned with grace. I want to tell you, you know why I think Daniel was able to stay faithful to God? Because Daniel, number one, understood God's in control. Number two, he had developed the spiritual discernment and taste that allowed him to approach others, even the people taking his life, potentially taking his life in the right way and with some tact and consideration. Tell you something else about Daniel. Daniel believed in the power of prayer. You know what Daniel's first response was? He said, God can interpret this dream. And he goes back, and his first thing is to tell Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego, you go and you pray for me. And then Daniel also prays God. He understood that prayer is powerful. It makes a difference. The effective, fervent prayer of a righteous man avails much, the Bible tells us, James chapter 5 and 16 and 17. Prayer can provide wisdom in times of difficulty. I don't know if Daniel prayed or not, but I tell you, in a similar circumstance before a king in Nehemiah chapter 1, Nehemiah immediately prayed to God. And you know, when I need wisdom in circumstances, I'm finding myself, and I don't know how to say things. I don't know how to approach things, and I need some wisdom. You know what the Bible said? If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask of God, who gives to all liberally and without reproach, and it'll be given to you. That's in the context, by the way, talking about dealing with trials and tribulations in life. I think too many times when we're faced with those difficulties like what Daniel did, maybe prayer is not our first order of response. It's not the first thing that we do, but it was for Daniel. He went to God in prayer and he asked for God. It can help in the time of temptation. Watch and pray that you enter not into temptation. The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. You know what happened? Daniel believed in the power of prayer. And I'll tell you something else about the power of prayer. Not only did Daniel believe in the power of prayer, Daniel realized that he needed the Lord in that circumstance. He wasn't going to get through it on his own. He wasn't going to get through it because he couldn't interpret that dream on his own. And he needed the Lord to help him. But Daniel's not alone in his need for the Lord. In this world of tribulation and temptation and persecution, I can't do it on my own. It's just not possible. You know who I need? I need others. We'll talk about that in just a moment. But first and foremost, I need the Lord. And 1 Peter chapter 5 and verses 6 and verse 7 said, humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time, casting all your cares upon him, that he may exalt you. Or cast all your cares upon him, for he cares for you. That's all one sentence, by the way, in the English as well as in the Greek. And making a comment upon that, the New American Commentary, when it talks about casting his cares upon, they said the NIV begins verse 7 with the command, cast all your anxiety. The Greek text, however, uses the participle casting. And hence the NASB represents a better translation, casting all your anxiety upon him. The participle should be understood as an instrumental participle, and it explains how believers can humble themselves under the mighty hand of God. How do I humble myself under God's mighty hand? Part of the way I do that is by casting all my cares upon him, by going to him in prayer and just turning my troubles over to the Lord. The NET said, God will exalt you in due time if you humble yourselves under his mighty hand by casting all your cares upon him because he cares for you. Daniel realized he needed the Lord. But Daniel's not alone in that. I need the Lord. I need to cast all my cares upon him. I need the Lord to help me guard my heart and my mind and keep me faithful to the Lord. And so how could Daniel do it? Well, Daniel believed in the power of prayer. In times of difficulty, temptation, and discouragement, how often do you turn to the Lord in prayer? I'll tell you something else about Daniel. I think Daniel was able to stay faithful to God because Daniel didn't believe in going it alone. Daniel knew he needed the Lord, but I think Daniel immediately told his friends and asked him to pray for them. You know, oftentimes we are of the mindset that we'll deal with things on our own. You know, if I've got some struggle, some weakness, I don't want to tell you about it because what? I can deal with it on my own. I'll fix things on my own. That's a dangerous spiritual perspective to have. Daniel realized he needed his friends. We are stronger when we lean on each other. Again, Ecclesiastes chapter 4, verses 9 through verse 12. And the Bible said that, you know, that a three-fold cord is not easily broken. You take a rope and you begin to untwine that. Each one of those little pieces of thread by themselves are pretty easy to break. But when you wind them together, they become a rope that's nearly unbreakable. And the point of that is the need that we have for one another. And that there's strength when we learn to rely on one another. Daniel was humble enough to come back and tell his friends, I need you to pray for me in my circumstance. That's why the Lord sent the disciples out 2 by 2 as opposed to 1 by 1 at a time, because he realized there's strength what? When we're together. And so what do we have to learn from that? Well, I learned that all great Bible characters, by the way, gain strength from others. The apostles relied on others. Paul sought help from others. We care for one another. Do you ever ask somebody and say, I need your prayers? Here's something I'm going. By the way, and this is an important lesson, sometimes I hear people that complain and say, well, nobody was there for me. Well, did you let them know you needed something? You know a principle of 1 Corinthians chapter 2? Nobody knows the thing of man save the spirit of man that is what? That's within him. I don't know what you're going through unless what? Unless you tell me. I don't know what prayers you need all the time unless you tell me. You don't know what I'm going through or the prayers that I need unless I tell you. And it takes humility to be able to say, you know what? Pray for me. Here's something I'm going through. I think Daniel realized if he was going to make it, he needed the help from others along the way. And he was humble enough that he was able to do that. 2 more points of the lesson will be yours. Daniel remembered to express his thanks to God. I don't know about you, but I find it interesting that when Daniel got the dream's interpretation, he didn't just run to the king. But before he ran to the king, he thanks God. I thank you and I praise you. There's something, by the way, that Daniel apparently had already been in the habit of doing. Daniel chapter 6, Daniel's about in probably his 80s by that point in time, probably about 85 years old by the time Daniel 6 takes place. And he's in the lion's den. But you remember he was arrested and put in the lion's den because what was he doing? He was praying. The New King James says that he opened his window toward Jerusalem and he prayed and he gave thanks as was his custom since early days. Now, Daniel was in the habit of telling God thanks. You know what you realize when you begin to thank God? You begin to realize how blessed you are. You begin to realize all that God has done for us. How often do we have requests, but we forget to express the gratitude? In all circumstances, we need to do that. Ephesians 5:20, in everything, give thanks. And I tell you, as Daniel thanked God, it was A, a reminder of where his blessings came from, and B, it was a reminder of how blessed he is. You go home tonight. Before you go to bed, just close your eyes without thinking of any request made known to God. Just think of how blessed you are. Think of the prayers that God has answered. Think of the things that God has done through you and through others, and give God. And you know what you realize before you go to bed? You have been blessed. You have a lot to be thankful for. And all those blessings came from God, and I want to show my gratitude by how I serve Him. I think Daniel was able to stay faithful to God because Daniel expressed things. One thing I've alluded to already very quickly is Daniel was humble. Daniel's humility, I think, is seen in a couple of things. First of all, in asking for help from his companions. You know, to say, I need you, that's an act of humility. It's also an act of humility for him to give God the glory for interpreting the dream. Daniel makes it very clear from beginning to end, I can't do this. God's the one that gets the glory. Now, Daniel was blessed by the Lord because of his faith in him, but Daniel wasn't in it for the glory. Daniel wasn't in it. In fact, Daniel did all he could to deflect the glory to the Lord for all that had been accomplished. The humble submit themselves to God. And Daniel, I think, was truly humble, just like a little child in Matthew chapter 18 and in verse 4. And I think there's no doubt that there's no wonder as to why Daniel is listed in the book of Ezekiel chapter 14, alongside Noah and alongside Job as examples of faithfulness to God. We've seen in 2 chapters, Daniel 1 and Daniel 2, what is still a very young man, but an impressive young man that with his life on the line twice has maintained his faith in the Lord. Could you do the same as Daniel? I don't know how many people have said after last week, you know who one of my favorite Bible characters is? It's Daniel. You may be like me. Some of my favorite Bible characters are whichever one I'm talking about at that moment in time. There's so much to learn from these men. And I think we can continue to learn more as we take our journey through the life of Daniel and just wonder, what is it that made him a man treasured by God? And we certainly learned something about that in Daniel 2. Who will follow Jesus? It is the invitation song, and that'll be the time in this assembly for one that needs to respond to obedience to the gospel. If you're not a Christian and you want to become one, you can do that this very evening. If you're a child of God that has wandered away, need to make things right, you can do that as well. No matter what your need is, take advantage of this opportunity. Respond right now. Together we stand.